To be able to walk upon the surface of water was a symbol of being able to walk between the worlds of life and death without care. He was therefore special, a man of God. He was a psychopomp, a man who could bring messages from the other world for us. Other cultures would call him shaman or witch doctors. There is much more depth to the simple story of a man walking on water than even that. But as an example, it does reveal how interpretations can differ vastly. I could even suggest that it was a magic trick, or that anybody can walk on water when the lake has frozen over. The Bible code is no different. Interpreting the letters and words of Hebrew is notoriously difficult, because each letter is in fact a number and a word in itself. And it can easily depend upon the person deciphering the code and his religious or political intent as to the meaning that we are told. There is no Hebrew specifically for Bin Laden, and yet we are told that is the interpretation given. Now Bin Laden is dead, will the interpretation change? A similar misinterpretation has often been applied to the so-called prophecies of Nostradamus and his mention of Hitler. It is in fact a misinterpretation.
In diesem geschichtlichen Augenblick, da ich nun den Grundstein zum deutschen Stadion lege, erfüllen mich drei heiße Wünsche. Erstens,
and yet, ever since the texts were placed upon parchment, scholars have been busy trying to unravel the codes. Even such greats as Sir Isaac Newton believed them to be true and attempting their deciphering. ELS, however, probably came to light in around the 13th century, when the Spanish rabbi Basha Banesha may have discovered it. He based his analysis on the 0 point of the Hebrew calendar, and others adapted this and moved forward. It was not quite ELS, but it was close. Because such research was the remit of biblical scholars, it was relatively unknown to the masses. Around the world, rabbis and occultists worked away as the world turned and entered a modern age. Then in the 1980s, Rips, Wisdom and Rothenberg took up the previous work of Avraham Aren and began creating computer software to do the analysis for them. By 1985, they were ready to carry out a formal test, and what later became known as the Great Rabbi's Experiment began. What they set out to do was test the names of various famous rabbis, their personalities, birth, and death dates. By entering these into the computer, the ELS program would search for skip numbers to see if all the details came up in one string. This, by all reckoning, would be more than chance would allow. After several iterations and statistical analysis, the scholars were finally ready to release their results in 1994. It was revealed first to Statistical Science magazine, who put it through 3 peer reviews before publishing. All the peers were baffled. Even though sceptical, the evidence was there, right before their eyes. The mathematics and statistics backed up the fact that the ancient texts of the Bible somehow had the names, births, and death rates, and even personalities of rabbis not born until centuries after it was written. Baffled indeed. The magazine knew that the alarming results would cause shock amongst its readership and the world at large, and so they published it as a challenging puzzle rather than as hard evidence. Rips and Wisdom performed more and more experiments, and the majority of them were successful, adding yet further evidence to their case. One such experiment took the names of the famous rabbis and matched them against the places of birth rather than the dates. This experiment was conducted in 1997 by Harold Guns, the former and senior cryptologic mathematician for the US National Security Agency. The experiment was a resounding success. Again, the ancient text revealed information embedded within that simply would have been unknown at the time of writing. The results were declared meaningful and suggestive of more than the result of chance. By now, the wider world was catching on, and one astute reporter, Michael Joslin, was on the case. He released the international best-selling book, The Bible Code. And suddenly the world was talking about this amazing and alarming discovery. Rips was not happy and issued a public statement declaring such. Harold Gans, when talking about the claim that the Torah would be used to predict future events, said, "This is absolutely unfounded. There is no scientific or mathematical basis for such a statement. And the reasoning used to come to such a conclusion in the book is logically flawed." They were all distancing themselves from the more glamorous side of the discovery. Once the knowledge of the Bible Code filtered out to a wider audience, it was taken up by groups who used it to bring followers to their faith. Jewish outreach groups used it in seminars, and Christians spread the message far and wide. Physicist Nathan Jacobi and engineer Moshe Haron took the process further and claimed they found hundreds of very lengthy examples of ELS. This, they claimed, was statistical proof for the validity of codes being hidden in the Bible. There are problems. The first one is the actual age of the texts. The Hebrew Masoretic text used by researchers was not actually finished in the form we have today until the 1st century. This was the work of Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph, who brought the text together and gave it form. But in the 20th century, a remarkable discovery at Qumran gave the world older versions. These became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there is not constant number of letters within them, meaning the results of our modern experiments would not work. The second objection is that researchers are actually bending the extracted information for their own purposes. Namely, to convince the public that God does exist and the Bible is His word. This cooking of the books simply means that the researchers create criteria they know will work. Objectors point out that using the same process, they can find codes in almost any book. The probability of ELS discovering a meaningful word is small. To discover a string of related words that make up a sentence is even smaller. And yet, because the researcher can choose any starting point with any value of skip numbers, that probability is increased. If there is enough effort, or indeed, if the required words are fed into a computer, eventually a result will be found. Why? Because there are thousands and thousands of words and millions of letters, and Hebrew is a strange language that can have its entire meaning altered by just the change of one letter. In 1999, a major blow came to the Bible Code proponents. Several mathematicians and a psychologist got together and submitted a paper to the magazine that originally ran the story, Statistical Science. They stated that the work of the original researchers was fatally flawed. They said it was defective. Indeed, that their result merely reflects on the choices made in designing their experiments and collecting data for it. This paper was again reviewed independently by anonymous experts. When published, the editor wrote, "Considering their work as a whole, it indeed appears as they conclude that the puzzle has been solved." This is what the paper concluded. The research method, they said, was susceptible to systematic bias. The researchers had thousands of choices they could have made. Any number of people and dates. It was possible they had pre-checked. There was no evidence of any independent preparation of the research criteria, which leaves the data open to bias. That by doing a similar experiment using War and Peace, they actually achieved similar results. This, they said, showed that the freedom provided just in the selection appellations was sufficient to explain the strong result. They stated that there was strong evidence for tuning. This means that the original researchers had altered their research criteria, such as the format of the dates, in order to get their desired result. They said the experiments were tuned towards an overly idealised result, consistent with the common expectations of statistically naive researchers. When they attempted to replicate the original experiments using independent experts, the results were actually negative. They had not attempted to fine-tune or come at the search criteria with any bias, and so found nothing. They pointed out that the original version of Genesis differed vastly from that used by the original researchers and would not give the same results. The Word of God, therefore, was not what they were using. In short, what they were pointing out was the original researchers had cheated. They even pointed out how that cheating was done. In short, they stated that the names and dates had been selected in advance with bias, and that the experiment was designed to match their desired result. The fact that tuning the experiment allowed the original researchers wiggle room also allowed the debunkers to find the results they were looking for in War and Peace. A book not written by the Almighty, it was, they said, a carefully designed magic trick. And worse than that, a hoax that had duped millions of people around the globe. As Harold Gans stated, the whole fiasco would mean that not only the original researchers had conspired to fraudulently con people, but that several of other rabbis involved had done so too. Because they had written testament confirming the accuracy of the experiments. He argued that this was not the case, because it would also have to include himself. He said the number of people necessarily involved in the conspiracy will stretch the credulity of any reasonable person. However, Mackay, one of the debunkers, replied that there only needed to be one person to have been involved in the fakery, with a handful of disciples aiding in the cover-up. This public battle did not end there. The original researchers fought back. They said no such tuning had occurred, and that some of the new research actually validated their own conclusions. This validation, they said, had been removed from the debunkers' evidence, and that this was tuning as well. However, nobody else had since come forward refuting the debunkers' claims. But several new Bible code papers have. It is as if they're ignoring the battle and going forward with their own research regardless. A Nobel Prize winner in economics, Robert Aumann, has been a keen follower of the Bible Code debate. He stated,